This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide a helpful first reading for students in the Academy's Classical Logic course. In this video we'll be reading Chapter 3 of Whately's Elements of Logic, and that's Lesson 3 in the Academy's Classical Logic course. This is a lengthy lesson, so I'm going to just get right to it and read through this. It's understood that you have access to previous videos, so you can go back and review if you'd like, but I'm going to move right into Lesson 3 here and try to get through the entire chapter in as little time as possible, making a few comments just where I think there's some information that's helpful for students to hear before they begin studying this lesson for themselves. So let's make our first reading together of Chapter 3, or Lesson 3 in Classical Logic. In an argument, such as the examples above given, it is, as has been said, impossible for anyone who admits both premises to avoid admitting the conclusion. This really is the key to the art and science of reasoning. This is why it's so important, why it's so powerful. Once we understand how reasoning works, we talked about the syllogism in the last lesson. Once we understand how reasoning works, how our minds actually come to conclusions from premises, it's easy to understand that if the premises are true, and we have a real, not an apparent syllogism, but a real syllogism, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It is impossible for anyone who admits both premises to avoid admitting the conclusion of a true argument, of a true syllogism. This is what's most important. If we can understand how to arrange and present syllogisms, our conclusions will be irrefutable. It will be impossible for anyone to deny the conclusion who admits the premises. So we really want to understand this art of reasoning, this art of logic, so that we can produce syllogisms which make it obvious and necessary that our conclusions, or the real point that we're trying to make, must be true. A man may perhaps deny or doubt and require proof that all animals that are horned do ruminate. Remember, that was an example we studied in the previous lesson. A man may deny, may doubt, may require proof that all animals that are horned do ruminate. Nay, it is conceivable or understandable that he may even not clearly understand what the word ruminant means. But still, it will be not the less clear to him that, supposing these premises granted, the conclusion must be admitted. So notice, we talked about this in a previous lesson, notice there are two different qualities of a syllogism. First of all, whether the premises are in fact true, and secondly, whether the conclusion, according to the rules of logic, whether the conclusion actually follows from the premises. Even if a person didn't understand the premises, he would have to admit that if they were true, supposing they were true, the conclusion would necessarily be true. That's what a syllogism does. Even if you suppose a case where one or both of the premises shall be manifestly false and absurd, even if the premises might be absurd, this will not alter the conclusiveness of the reasoning. In other words, that the conclusion does follow necessarily from those premises. Even if you suppose a case where one or both of the premises may be false and absurd, this will not alter the conclusiveness of the reasoning, though the conclusion itself may perhaps be absurd also. We're not talking about the truth of the conclusion. We're talking about the conclusiveness or the reasonableness of the conclusion. For instance, all the ape tribe are originally descended from reptiles or insects. Mankind are of the ape tribe. Therefore, mankind are originally descended from reptiles or insects. Here, everyone would perceive the falsity of all three of these propositions. But it is not the less true that the conclusion follows from those premises. And if they were true, it would be true also. So we have here an example of a syllogism where, and again, pay careful attention to the words, if the two premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. We're not saying that the premises are true. We're not saying that the conclusion is true. We're saying if the premises are true in this argument, the conclusion must be true. Now, just a quick side note here, you can see why this is so important. Because if we can form a syllogism like this, to prove that this conclusion is true, that mankind are originally descended from reptiles or insects, all that we need to do is prove that the two premises are true. And this is really what modern science is for. It's to prove that some premises are true or false by experimentation. So when we form a syllogism, we lay out the argument. Then we can go about proving the premises to be true. And if we succeed in demonstrating that the two premises are true, we will have proven that the conclusion is true. This is the power of a syllogism. Everyone would perceive, for this argument, the falsity of all three of the propositions, but it is not the less true that the conclusion follows from those premises, and if they were true, the conclusion would be true also. But there will be frequently an apparent. Remember I said in the first lesson that this word apparent is important in logic because apparent is not necessarily true. Apparent can actually be a deception. It appears to be reasonable, but it's not. There will be frequently an apparent connection of premises with a conclusion which does not in reality, or which does not truly follow from them, though to the inattentive or the unskillful, the argument may appear to be valid. This is how people are deceived. This is why sophists, people who deceive, are so effective, because inattentive people, people who don't pay attention, and unskillful people, people who are not well trained in logic, the arguments appear to be valid. That's what makes them deceptive. There are many other cases in which a doubt may exist whether the argument will be valid or not. That is, whether it be possible or not to admit the premises but deny the conclusion. Notice this word valid. Valid means conclusive, whether the argument be conclusive or not. That is, whether it be possible or not to admit the premises and yet deny the conclusion. If we have an apparent syllogism, it looks like a syllogism, but on careful examination we find that it's not really a syllogism. It may be possible to admit that both of the premises are true, but the conclusion does not follow necessarily from them. It is of the highest importance, therefore, to lay down some regular form to which every valid argument may be reduced, and to devise a rule which shall show the validity of every argument in that form, and consequently the unsoundness or falsity of any apparent argument which cannot be reduced to that one true form. E.g. stands for example. If such an argument as this be proposed, so let's look at this example argument. Every rational agent is accountable. Brutes are not rational agents. Therefore, they are not accountable. So consider that argument. Every rational agent is accountable. Brutes are not rational agents. Therefore, brutes are not accountable. Or again, all wise legislators suit their laws to the genius of their nation. Solon did this. Therefore, Solon was a wise legislator. There are some, perhaps, who would not perceive any fallacy in such arguments, especially if it was enveloped or enclosed in a cloud of words, and still more when the conclusion is true, or which comes to the same point, if they are disposed to believe it. Let me read that again to make it clearer. There are some who would read these two examples and would not perceive any fallacy in them, especially if those arguments were enveloped in a cloud of words, and still more when the conclusion is true, which makes it even more confusing, or if they are disposed to believe it, that is, if they like the conclusion and want it to be true. Others might perceive indeed, but might be at a loss to explain the fallacy. So with these two examples, they're apparent syllogisms. They're not reasonable arguments. And if you think about them, you may be able to catch the fallacy. Every rational agent is accountable. Every rational agent is accountable. Now, the way you should think about these things is to use diagrams. Think of a big circle which contains all accountable things. Think of a big circle, and that circle contains all accountable things. Now we read, every rational agent is accountable. That means that inside that accountable circle is a smaller circle titled rational agent, and all rational agents are contained in that smaller circle. But that whole circle is inside the larger circle of things that are accountable. So keep that image in your mind. There's a big circle of accountable things, and inside it, there's a smaller circle of rational agents. Now listen to the second premise. Brutes are not rational agents. Brutes are not rational agents. So if we're thinking about our diagram, we have this large circle that contains all things that are accountable. We have this smaller circle of rational agents, which is inside the circle of things accountable. And we're told that no brutes are rational agents. In other words, no brutes are inside that smaller circle. Does it necessarily follow then that all brutes are not accountable, or that no brutes are accountable? The answer is no, it doesn't follow. Because if we think about that diagram, just because a brute is outside of the circle of rational agents doesn't mean that they're all outside the circle of accountable things. And so we've got to be very careful, because thinking of the argument in terms of that diagram, we can see that that conclusion that no brute is accountable does not necessarily follow from the truth of those two premises. There are a number of different places the circle of brutes could go. It has to be outside of the circle of rational agents, but it could still be inside the circle of accountable things. It could be half in and half outside of accountable things, or it could be entirely outside accountable things. So those two premises do not lead necessarily to that conclusion. It's a fallacy. It's an apparent syllogism. And when I read it, listen to this again. Every rational agent is accountable. Brutes are not rational agents. Therefore, they are not accountable. I think you'll agree that that looks, at first look, that looks like it may be a good argument. And many arguments that we receive and hear daily are like this argument. At first glance, they look reasonable. But if you actually take the time to think through them, diagram them, have that idea in your head, you'll see that this conclusion does not follow from those premises. This is actually not a good argument, not a reasonable argument. The same is true in the second example. All wise legislators suit their own laws to the genius of their nation. So we have a circle of all wise legislators, and all of the wise legislators are inside that circle. And then we have a larger circle of legislators who suit their laws to the genius of their nation, and all wise legislators is inside that larger circle. Solon did this. Solon suited his laws to the genius of the nation, therefore he was a wise legislator. That conclusion does not follow from those premises, because Solon, just speaking logically, Solon could have been a wise legislator. He could have been outside the circle of legislators who suit their laws to the genius of their own nation. But he still could have been inside the circle of all wise legislators. So that syllogism is not a real syllogism. It's an apparent syllogism. It's a fallacy. And now some people, the lesson says, most people wouldn't be able to discern that something was wrong there. Some people could discern that something was wrong, but they couldn't explain what it is. The purpose of studying logic is not only to recognize a false argument, but also to be able to explain why the argument is false. Obviously, a very important lesson. Let's pick up down here. Now these apparent arguments exactly correspond with the following: the absurdity of the conclusions from which is manifest. So what the author does here is he presents an argument in the same exact form as the other two arguments, but the conclusion is not true. Actually, these arguments are going to appear ridiculous. And the point is, while this may appear ridiculous, it's actually the same argument that was made for the other two examples, which appeared like they could be reasonable. So let's look at this example, this absurd example. Every horse is an animal. Every horse is an animal. So picture a large circle containing all animals, and then in that circle is a smaller circle containing all horses. So all horses is inside all animals. Sheep are not horses. Therefore, sheep are not animals. Now, this conclusion can be pretty easily recognized as false. So when the conclusion is false, or when the conclusion states something that we don't like, we will naturally or quickly object to it. The danger, as he showed, is that sometimes the false conclusion can be something that we will accept as true, and therefore we accept the whole argument. But here, because we know that sheep are animals, this argument becomes ridiculous. Every horse is an animal. Sheep are not horses. So if sheep are not horses, then where would their circle be found? Just because they're not horses, their circle would be outside of the horse's circle. It could be inside the animal circle. It could be half in, half outside the animal circle, or it could be entirely outside the animal circle. So we can see that that argument is not conclusive. But that's the same exact argument that was made before about rational agents and about Solon, the lawmaker. Those arguments appeared to be good arguments, but this, because we can see that the conclusion is false, appears to be a bad argument. They're the same arguments. They're all bad. Here's another example. All vegetables grow, or we could say this, all vegetables are growing things. So if we have a circle that represents all of the growing things, vegetables would be a smaller circle inside that circle. We then learn an animal grows, therefore an animal is a vegetable. But if we think of the diagram of that argument, we'll see that that's not necessarily true. Just because, let's just read this one more time. All vegetables grow, an animal grows, therefore it is a vegetable. Just because an animal grows does not mean that it must be inside the vegetable circle. It could be inside the growing things circle, but not be a vegetable. The conclusion, therefore it is a vegetable, is not conclusive. These last arguments, I have said, correspond exactly with the former. The question respecting the validity, the reasonableness of an argument, being not whether the conclusion is true or false, but whether it follows from the premises adduced. So when we talk about the validity of an argument, we're not asking whether it's true or false. We're asking whether the conclusion follows from the premises. Okay? Now, what he had just said is that what would be really helpful is if we could have some example that we could use as the standard, which would help us to examine all arguments that we encounter. It'd be nice to have some kind of standard or pattern that we could compare all arguments to easily tell if it's valid or not. He says, this mode of exposing a fallacy by bringing forward a similar one whose conclusion is obviously absurd is often and very advantageously resorted to in addressing those who are ignorant of logical rules. So he says, I just showed you a good way to prove that something is unreasonable and that we should make use of that method. But to lay down such rules and employ them as a test is evidently a safer and more compendious as well as a more philosophical mode of proceeding or going forward. To attain these, it would plainly be necessary to analyze some clear and valid arguments and to observe in what their conclusiveness consists. So you may have heard it said that the way that you can tell if money is fake money is by getting to know real money. If you get to know real money, you'll be able to identify fake money because you'll be familiar enough with the real money to recognize that the fake money is fake. The same thing is true with reasoning. With reasoning, we want to do the same thing. We want to study and get familiar with true or sound arguments, I should say valid arguments. And if we're familiar with valid arguments, then we'll begin to be able to easily recognize apparent arguments or false arguments. So what we're going to do here, and really through the rest of the study of logic, is get to know valid arguments, the arrangement of valid arguments as if we were studying real money and getting to know every detail of real money, becoming intimately familiar with it so we can then easily detect a counterfeit dollar. We're going to analyze and study valid arguments, understand what makes them valid, become intimately familiar with valid arguments so that we'll become very sensitive, very discerning with respect to false arguments. So you can see how valuable this is, not just for academic work, not just for intellectual things, not just for debate, but for our own moral and spiritual lives. This art and science of logic will help us to discern the deceptions that we're tempted with, understand exactly what about them is deceiving, and therefore strengthen us to resist those temptations. So it's not just an academic exercise. Saint Ignatius of Loyola, I always quote this, Saint Ignatius of Loyola said that the devil is a sophist. The devil is a sophist. He is a deceiver who uses apparent syllogisms. He uses invalid or inconclusive arguments to deceive us. The devil is a sophist. The art of reasoning is a very powerful weapon to resist temptations and deceptions. So we're going to study what's true so that we can easily identify what's false. So let's get on to the next section here. You see in the margin it says analysis of an argument. The word analysis means to take something and break it down into its parts so that it can be studied. Let us then examine and analyze such an example as one of those first given. For instance, every animal that has horns on the head is a ruminant. The elk has horns on his head, therefore the elk is a ruminant. It will easily be seen that the validity or the conclusiveness or the soundness, I wouldn't use the word soundness because usually soundness means that it's also true, not just conclusive but true. But validity and conclusive can be used interchangeably. It will easily be seen that the validity of the argument does not depend on our conviction of the truth of either of the premises, or even on our understanding of the meaning of them. If we substitute for one of the things we are speaking about some unmeaning symbol, any symbol, which may stand for anything that may be agreed on, the reasoning remains the same. So what we're actually arguing about, the actual content of the argument, is not as important as the form or the arrangement of the argument itself. For instance, suppose we say instead of animal that has horns on its head, we just use the letter X and say every X is a ruminant. The elk is X, therefore the elk is the ruminant. The argument has exactly the same form and is equally valid. Every X is a ruminant. The elk is X, therefore the elk is a ruminant. Now what's different about this argument, let's talk about the diagram real quick. Think about the diagram with me, and you may need to jot this down, but if we think in terms of diagrams, these arguments can be very easy to understand. Every X is a ruminant. Every X is a ruminant. Now what that means is, if we think of our diagram, we have a large circle of ruminant animals. All ruminant animals are contained in this large circle. Inside that circle is a smaller circle labeled X. Every X is inside the ruminant circle. Every X is ruminant. So picture that, a large circle labeled ruminants and a smaller circle inside labeled X. Every X is inside the ruminant circle. Every X is a ruminant. In the second premise, we're told the elk is X. That means that the elk is inside the circle labeled X. If the elk is inside the circle labeled X, and if the circle X is inside the circle ruminant, then it must be true that the elk is inside the circle ruminant. That's the form of this valid syllogism. Let again, instead of the word ruminant, let us put the letter Y. Then the argument would be, every X is Y, the elk is X, therefore the elk is Y. Notice we're getting into a form like we're studying algebra. We're getting to a formula, and the formula is the formula of a valid argument. And so it doesn't matter what the terms actually are. We can change the terms as long as the formula of the argument is as it is explained here. The argument will be valid. So if we replace the word ruminant with the letter Y, then we'll have this argument. So we'll have a large circle labeled Y and a smaller circle labeled X inside the circle Y. We'll then be told that the elk is inside circle X. We know that the circle X is inside the circle Y. Therefore, elk, since it's inside circle X, must be inside circle Y. Therefore, it's a valid argument. The same would be the case if you were to put Z for the elk. So if we become even more symbolic, if you put Z for the elk, we would have the syllogism, every X is Y, Z is X, therefore Z is Y. If you use that illustration, that diagram, you'll see how clear that is. This statement is completely valid, whatever you suppose the symbols X, Y, and Z to stand for. So we have this formula here. This is the formula of a valid argument. Every X is Y, Z is X, therefore Z is Y. So now you can see if you learn this formula, you can take this formula and begin to hold it up to every argument you hear and ask whether that argument follows this formula or not. And we're going to learn a couple of these formulas, but there's one that's most important. One may try the experiment by substituting for x, y, and z any words he pleases, and he will find that if he does but preserve the same form of expression or formula as I said, it will be impossible to admit that the premises are true without admitting also that the conclusion is true. And it is very worth observing here that nothing is so likely to lead to that very common, though seemingly strange error. Let me read that again. It is worth observing here that nothing is so likely to lead to that error of supposing ourselves to understand distinctly what in reality we understand but very imperfectly or not at all, as the want of attention to what has been just explained. So the point that the author is making here is that reasoning can be boiled down to formulas. We don't even need to understand the content of the argument that's being made. We can simply look at the form of the argument and immediately dismiss the argument as inconclusive. Now note that that doesn't mean that the conclusion is false. It simply means that the reasoning provided to prove the truth of that conclusion, the reasoning is invalid. Let's keep going here. A man reads or even writes many pages of an argumentative work in which one or more of the terms employed convey nothing distinct to his mind. Yet he is liable to overlook this circumstance from finding that he clearly understands the arguments. He may not understand the content, but he understands the arguments. He may be said, in one sense, to understand what he is reading, because he can perfectly follow the train of reasoning itself. But this perhaps he might equally well do if he were to substitute for one of the words employed, x or z, or any other such unknown symbol, as in the examples above. But a man will often confound together the understanding of the arguments in themselves and the understanding of the words employed, and of the nature of things those words denote. So there's a difference between understanding what the words mean in an argument and understanding the argument itself. In classical reasoning, our first concern is understanding the reasoning itself. We can't even always determine whether the statements are true or not, but we can tell if the conclusion follows from the premises. It appears then that valid reasoning, when regularly expressed, has its validity or conclusiveness made evident from the mere form of the expression itself, independently of any regard to the sense of words. In examining this form, in such an example as that just given, you will observe that in the first premise, x is y, it is assumed universally of the class of things which x denotes that y may be affirmed of them. Now that's a difficult sentence for you to listen to and understand, but what's said in that sentence there is exactly what I explained with a diagram. So if you go back if you need to, or just think about the diagrams that I explained, this is what's explained here in this sentence. You will observe that in the first premise where we said x is y, it is assumed universally of the class of things which x denotes. So it is assumed universally of all things that are in the circle x that y may be affirmed of them. And in the other premise, the second premise, where we read Z is X, it is understood that Z is referred to that class as comprehended in it or contained within it. So think of the illustration that I provided with circles. You may need to listen to those parts again and draw them out on a sheet of paper, but if you learn to use this diagram method that I'm explaining to you, you'll find that these issues in logic, judging the quality of syllogisms, is actually very easy. Now, it is evident that whatever is said of the whole of a class may be said of anything that is comprehended in that class. Rather than comprehended, I like the word contained. Contained in that class. So we are thus authorized to say in the conclusion of that argument that Z is Y. So in that paragraph there, you have a good explanation of the arrangement of a syllogism, which you're going to need to study more on your own in this lesson. Thus also in the example first given, having assumed universally of the class of things which exhibit marks of design that they had an intelligent maker, and then in the other premise he referred the world to that class, we conclude that it may be asserted of the world that it, quote, had an intelligent maker. And the process is the same when anything is denied of a whole class. So the first formula we have was given up here. The first formula we have was X is Y, or all X is Y, Z is X, therefore all Z is Y. That's the first form of a valid argument. And so here we have a second formula for a valid argument. The process is the same. The reasoning process is the same when anything is denied of a whole class. So in the first example, we said a valid argument can be in the form of that where something is asserted of a subject. Here we say something is being denied of the whole class of subjects, and that leads us to a conclusion. The process is the same when anything is denied of a whole class. We are equally authorized to deny the same of whatever is comprehended under that class. For instance, here's an example. No liar is deserving of trust. That's the first premise. No liar is deserving of trust. So that means if we draw a circle and we label that circle things that are deserving of trust. So we have a big circle labeled things deserving trust. And we say no liar is deserving of trust. That means that there is a circle, a smaller circle of liars that's outside of that first circle, because no liars are deserving of trust. The circle contains all those who are deserving of trust. Liars are not in that circle. So if we were to think of the diagram, you'd have this large circle of things deserving trust, and then you would have a small circle of liars, and that small circle of liars would be outside of the circle of things deserving trust. Then if we were to say, this man is a liar, that means he is contained in that circle of liars, then it must be true if those premises are true. If the circle of liars is outside the circle of deserving trust, and if this man is in that circle of liars, then it is necessary that this man is outside the circle of things deserving of trust. That's explained in that paragraph there. This argument also will be manifestly valid. The word manifestly means obvious. It means revealed or shown openly. This argument also will be as manifestly valid as in the former case, if you substitute for the words, which really aren't important, any undetermined symbols, such as the letters of the alphabet. If we say, no x is y, z is x, therefore z is not y. This is as perfect a syllogism as the other with affirmative conclusion. So we've learned two different syllogisms so far that are formulas or models of valid arguments. Two different formulas for valid arguments. And you can see if we learn these two formulas, we can use them to test any argument that we face. Any argument we come across, we can consider them in light of these two model valid arguments. Let's keep going here. And here it is to be observed that by class of things is meant throughout this treatise, throughout this book, not merely a head or a general description to which several things are actually referred, but one to which an indefinite number of things might conceivably be referred. So think of a class as a group of things. I told you to think of it as a container containing a number of things that match the title of that class. Namely, he says, as many as may answer to the description. For example, one may conceive that the first created man existed alone. Some superhuman beings may have contemplated him not merely as an individual bearing the proper name of Adam, but also by abstraction or more universally, simply as possessing those attributes which we call collectively humanity. So Adam was a man as an individual, but he was also man as a member of the class of human beings, things that possess the qualities of human beings. Because Adam possessed the attributes of a human being, he belonged to the class of human beings, and anything else that possesses the characteristics or attributes of a human being also belongs to that class. That's why I like to think of these in terms of circles, which are containers. So man would be a circle, and Adam would be inside that circle. Eve would also be inside that circle. You and I would also be inside that circle, that large circled, labeled man, which would be defined, and everything that matches that definition would be included in that circle. So the circle idea that I'm talking about is what they mean by class of things. Let's keep moving here. When anything is said to be referred to such and such a class, when anything is said to be referred to such and such a class, this is to be understood either of an actual class or what may be called a potential class. That is, the word class is used whether there actually exist or not several things to which the description will apply. So he's making a difference between an actual class and a class that might exist, a potential class. For it is evident that in any case we refer something to a certain class in consequence of that thing's possessing certain attributes, not vice versa. This being kept in mind, there is a convenience in employing the word class instead of introducing a circumlocution. Circumlocution means another way of saying the same thing by talking around it a bit, by using other words, another way of saying something. It's better, the author is teaching us, to use the word class than expressing that idea in some other way, always speaking of description. It will be found on examination that all valid arguments may be easily reduced to such a form as that of the foregoing syllogisms. Notice how important this is. All valid arguments may be easily reduced to the form of the two syllogisms we've learned in this lesson, and that consequently the principle on which they are constructed is the universal principle of reasoning. The universal principle of reasoning. So imagine this as the key that unlocks every argument. These two examples, these two forms of valid arguments that we've learned are the key to all reasoning. They are the universal principle of reasoning. So elliptical indeed is the ordinary mode of expression, even of those who are considered as prolix or productive writers, that is, so much is implied and left to be understood in the course of an argument, in comparison of what is actually stated, that a single sentence will often be found, though perhaps considered as a single argument, to contain, compressed into a short compass, a chain of several distinct arguments. So the point here is he's saying that logical arguments can be expressed in a confused way, crammed together. A number of different arguments can be present in one sentence, and therefore when we hear people say things, we have to learn to think logically, to think in terms of syllogisms, to take the big jumbled mess of what someone else says and separate it into all of its arguments. All of the arguments that are contained in that which is spoken, we've got to separate them all and then put them all to the test. That's the challenge of reasoning. But if each of these is fully developed and the whole of what the author intended to imply is stated expressly, it will be found that all the steps, even of the longest and most complex train of reasoning, may be reduced into the above form. In other words, it doesn't matter how complicated an argument looks, how complicated some message given by someone may look, they can all be broken down into simple syllogisms. We can break even the most complex messages down into simple syllogisms and put them to the test and find out whether what has been spoken is reasonable and hopefully if it's true. Note here in the margin we read the meaning of logical reasoning. It is a mistake to imagine that Aristotle and other logicians, other logic teachers, meant to propose that this prolix form of unfolding arguments should universally supersede in argumentative discourses the common forms of expression. In other words, when we read Aristotle teaching us the science and art of reasoning, we shouldn't imagine that he intended for everyone to speak in the exact forms of logical arguments. What he's showing us is the mechanics of how arguments actually work. But just because we understand the form of a syllogism, Aristotle's not teaching us necessarily that that's how we should actually speak. Rhetoric teaches us that there's much more to speech than just the argument. To reason logically means to state all arguments at full length in the syllogistic form. That's not what Aristotle was teaching us. Aristotle has even been charged with inconsistency for not doing so himself, even though he never told anyone to do that. It has been said that in his treatises of ethics, politics, and etc., He argues like a rational creature and never attempts to bring his own system into practice. So some people try to argue that when Aristotle explained how the syllogism worked and presented us with these formula for valid arguments, that he intended for us to actually speak like that every day and write like that. But that's not what he taught us. Again, he also wrote the book of Rhetoric, which explains how we're to speak eloquently. So some people criticize Aristotle, the author says, and accuse him of being a hypocrite because he supposedly tells us to talk in this really strict logical language, and he doesn't do so himself. The author says, no, actually, that's the proof that he never taught us to talk with strict logical arguments. So those criticisms of Aristotle are nonsense. Just as well, he says, might a chemist be charged with inconsistency for making use of any of the compound substances that are commonly employed without previously analyzing and resolving them into their simple elements. As well might it be imagined that to speak grammatically means to parse every single sentence we utter. The chemist keeps by him his tests and his method of analysis to be employed when any substance is offered to his notice, the composition of which has not been ascertained or in which adulteration is suspected. In other words, when a chemist uses different chemicals, he doesn't first break them all down into their individual elements and use them in that sort of a chemical way. The chemist uses complex substances of which he knows the contents. He knows the makeup of those complex substances, and he uses them as such. In the same way, Aristotle can break an argument down into its parts, into the real nuts and bolts of the argument, but he doesn't say that we need to do that every time we speak, or that it's necessary to speak like that. A fallacy may aptly be compared to some adulterated compound. A fallacy is like a mixed compound, like a compound that is supposed to contain one thing, or maybe it's sold as containing something, but really, quote, it consists of an ingenious mixture of what is true and what is false, so entangled, so intimately blended together that the falsehood is held in solution. Now this is chemical language, so you may not be comfortable with this, but I'll make it simpler for you. It's simply as if we're sold something and we're told that it contains a certain product, but really it's got stuff mixed in with it. A good example would be if we were purchasing some wine and we were told that we were being sold a bottle of wine, but we found out that it was actually a bottle that was about 3/4 of wine, a little bit of vinegar, and some water, because the maker of the wine was trying to save money and make more money on his wine sales by adulterating the content of the wine bottle. So it's presented to us as something that's true, but it actually contains falsehood mixed in with it in some way. And we've got to learn how to discern that. And a wise man will be able to discern when he's not getting what he's being told he's getting, or what another person is pretending to give him. He's got to be able to discern that it's false. One drop of sound logic is the test which immediately separates those different things, makes the foreign substance visible, and causes it to collect at the bottom. One drop of logic is like a chemical that when we drop it into an argument that's got a mixture of true and false in it, causes the falsehood to appear and separate itself. So he uses this illustration from chemistry. I don't think it's a very smart illustration to use since we can't guarantee that students in a logic class have studied chemistry yet. But the idea is very simple. Logic is like a special chemical that when dropped into the substance will cause the true and the false to separate and become visible. And so in life, we're constantly presented with messages, with words, with advertisements, with arguments, with temptations, with invitations, all of these different things we hear. And there's very often a mixture of truth and falsehood, a mixture of reasonableness and unreasonableness. And if we're not attentive and if we're not skillful in the art of logic, we will not be able to discern when false things are present and mingled with the true things. But if we do study the art of logic, especially after this lesson where we've learned the formula for these two valid arguments, if we begin to use these to test every argument, we'll be able to separate the true from the false. And this is what it means to be logical. This is what it means to be discerning and skillful in reasoning. So we're through the content of this third lesson. We're already over an hour. I told you it was a long lesson with lots of information. Really, we could say this is the most important lesson in logic because in this lesson, you learned what's called the universal principle of logic. And you've learned the two basic forms of arguments, which must be found in any argument if it's valid. So you've learned the test. You've got this bottle of logic chemical that you can drop into arguments and separate the true from the false. Now you've got to learn how to use it. So that's an overview of this third lesson. It's time for you now to study this lesson for yourself. Read through this lesson carefully. Take notes. There is no more important subject in your education than logic. This is the most important subject in your education. Study these lessons for mastery. Take notes. Make sure you understand everything you read in these lessons. Because if you get these lessons will unlock every other subject for you and give you so much help and advantage in life that you may never be deceived if you are skillful in reasoning and attentive. So I hope that that's a helpful overview. Study this lesson for yourself in detail. If there's anything in this lesson that you don't understand, post your questions on the support forum on the course page in the study center. And then after you've studied, complete the lesson assessments. Let me see how you're doing. And if everything looks good, we'll continue together through the study of logic. God bless your studies.